really an honor to be here. I've had a great privilege in my many last years of nursing to be a hospice nurse, and I'm more than happy to share the gifts that so many people have given to me. Today we want to talk about advanced directives, the POLST, the advanced planning documents for end of life, which of course in Oregon, we're kind of at the epicenter of a lot of these really thorny issues at end of life. And so these documents are very important to understand. They're not just a simple, the way to get what I want. And so we want to go through these. We want to look at some underlying principles, some changes in Oregon, and then I'll go through the advanced directive, and Chuck will talk about the POLST, and then we'll have some time for questions and answers and conclusions. So first of all, human life is sacred at all stages, and I'm certainly speaking to the choir about that. Not everybody gets that as well as everyone in this room. We have the duty to preserve and protect our lives using ordinary means. We expect each other, we expect that we take care of ourselves. If we find that someone is a threat to himself or others, we have ways of dealing with that in our society, because we expect that we are going to be reasonable stewards of our bodies, of ourselves, and others. Dignity is the inherent value in each and every person, regardless of circumstances. That runs counter to a sense of dignity in our culture a lot. And ordinary care is essential, and extraordinary care is not. Extraordinary care is optional. To determine what is ordinary and extraordinary, we really need to look at benefit and burden of each particular situation and each treatment. And then we're going to talk a fair amount about respect for autonomy. So first of all, human dignity. Here's a picture of a black man in prison, and he may not be that image may not be the first thing that comes to our minds when we hear the word dignity. But when we look a little deeper at this picture, who is that? It's Martin Luther King in the Birmingham jail. He had a lot to teach us about dignity. He showed us a whole lot about dignity in people that we wouldn't have used as poster children for dignity. So we look at dignity, there's facets. There's attributed, which is the external, visible, emotional sense we have. We hear someone say, oh, he's a really dignified gentleman. We have an image of someone who's really well presented, well together, well functioning, and that sort of thing. So we see those kind of attributes as symbols of dignity. It's like dignity on the surface, what we see and what we sense. And it fluctuates depending on the circumstances. We might think of, like I said here, a woman with a Mercedes in a suburban community. We might attribute a sense of dignity to her that would be far different from a prostitute who's homeless and addicted. So that's how our mind and our feelings go toward dignity. But what we're really talking about is that inherent worth of each and every person in the human family, regardless of circumstances, abilities, assets, age, all of those things. And I think this is a key point here in our culture, that it's regardless of whether or not the person feels a sense of his or her own dignity. And I think this is a really important point, that sometimes people don't sense that they're worth anything. And I often have said that one of the biggest parts of my job as a hospice nurse was often just to convince people of their worthiness, because they didn't feel like they deserved much in their circumstances. And of course it extends throughout the lifespan. Again, I'm preaching to the choir here. So when we talk about dignity in our culture, we really have to look at that whole arena of quality of life. It's such a huge go-to expression. I know you've all heard people say, oh, she just had no quality, so she just, gave up, didn't want any more treatment. It just had no quality. And so we have to really look deeply at that, because it's really arbitrary and unjust to look at life as measured in quality versus dignity. Who determines what's quality? And people have certainly different images of that. I was reading an article, an opinion piece written by a woman after Stephen Hawking's death, and she was commenting about a cartoon that she had seen after he died where his wheelchair was kind of off in the distance, like sort of crashed, and he was kind of ascended above his wheelchair. And as though this was the ultimate for him was to get out of his wheelchair, she said, "I love my wheelchair. This is part of me. I'm grateful for all that it does. It's not like I want to get out of it, but everyone assumes that's, I have this terrible burden in my life, but to me, this is the way I live. That's me." And so I think sometimes our imagination doesn't go very far in terms of how we ascribe quality of life to people. And of course, then we have the real problem of reducing people who have a low quality of life, not only in their own mind, but in ours, in terms of how we take care of them. So I want to talk a little bit about ordinary and extraordinary care, because we have such complicated issues in healthcare now. It's not like it was 100 years ago where you got old and you died in your house with your loved ones around you. There are so many treatments that have good and bad aspects to them. And I think there was a time when, with the advance of so many machines, people would tend to think, well, that machine is extraordinary, and ordinary care is just simply living and doing simple things until you die. But we really have to look at what's beyond, what are the benefits and what are the consequences and outcomes of those treatments themselves. So ordinary, proportionate, in the judgment of the patient, are means that offer a reasonable benefit and don't entail excessive burden or impose excessive expense and hardship upon people or their families. Extraordinary or disproportionate are those means that in the patient's judgment, again, it's in the patient's judgment, do not offer reasonable hope of benefit, and they might entail excessive burden or excessive expense for the family, might be psychologically repugnant, or tie up too many resources that have to be shared with other people. Could be that the person feels that they're close to death and that these treatments might entail things that entail burdens upon them that they don't want to be facing, when they might just be spending time more directly and more fully with their loved ones. Could be just that they're futile, that there's very little benefit that's going to come from this treatment. And so we don't look at the treatment itself. It's not like ventilators are extraordinary and hand feeding is ordinary. Ventilators might be ordinary care as a bridge treatment, getting someone from respiratory failure into better health. Or at the end of life, if someone's systems are declining, a ventilator might be something that's not going to do a whole lot of good, and it keeps the person unable to talk, unable to be touched, and at home. So it could be extraordinary at that point. So we look at the effects, the objective effects of each treatment upon the person, the specific circumstances, when we look at benefit burden and what's ordinary and what's extraordinary. So again, ordinary is the normal care that's due to a sick person and it's beneficial. Extraordinary might be experimental, risky, painful, repugnant, bad way to spend my time, futile, all of those things that would be burdensome. So, like I said, treatments in and of themselves are not categorized as ordinary or extraordinary, but we have to look at the benefit burden of each one. And then a little bit about autonomy. Of course, it's respect for the person's right to make choices and take action based on their own values and belief systems. We assume that the person has the capacity to act intentionally and rationally and isn't being coerced and isn't being controlled by other influences, and that it's a voluntary act. It's a voluntary choice, that this is an autonomous act. And it involves not only refraining from interfering with people's choices, but sometimes giving them adequate information to make those choices, like informed consent that we make such a big point of in our culture. And obviously, if someone is making a decision and you've got information that's relevant, you're probably going to say to them, well, you understand this, right? And you want to make sure that someone making an autonomous decision is really fully equipped with the ability to do this and all the information and understands the choices that the person is facing. So advanced directives are, they started in the 70s when we found ourselves in the midst of this new world of medicine where people were being kept alive on machines in ways that we weren't before. And so people were justifiably concerned about just being hooked up to machines, whether or not they were benefiting them or not. And so there was a movement to try to figure out a way that people could say in advance, direct in advance, what they wanted their care to be. And so advanced directives came about. It also, there's sort of a fusion of a movement at that time for euthanasia, for eugenics, and so those are all kind of factors that are floating through this whole evolution of future planning documents. But California passed the first statute in 1976 and Oregon shortly after. And then in 1990, Congress passed the Patient Self-Determination Act, which required all facilities with government money to ask people on admission to the facility if they have advanced directives in place and if they need information about them. The point is not to compel you to do these, to complete these forms, but simply to inform you that this is your right and to ask you if you have them and need more information. However, there are a lot of places that really give the impression that they're required. So the advanced directives have two functions. The first is to name a person to speak for you if you're not able to. It's called a healthcare representative on the actual form in Oregon, or medical power of attorney, surrogate caregiver, healthcare agent, but the term in Oregon is the healthcare representative. The second part is to give instructions for certain situations at end of life, whether you want CPR, life-sustaining treatment, or artificial hydration, tube feeding, and then they go through a number of situations. And so we really advise people to do the first part. We think it is really important to name someone legally who can speak for you if you're not able to yourself. But the second part, when we talk about what's ordinary care, what's extraordinary, what's beneficial, what's burdensome, really depends on the circumstances in the moment. And so it's impossible to predict 5 years, 10 years, 20 years ahead of time whether or not the circumstance of CPR or a feeding tube or ventilation would be appropriate at that time. So in Oregon, things are changing. House Bill 4135 was signed by Governor Brown in March, and there'll be big changes in the advanced directives. So we don't have those yet. That's why I don't have one today to put in front of you as an example. There are some good things that should come from this, like sort of cleaning up the format and allowing more information about reaching the healthcare representative, that sort of stuff. But the main area of concern is that the governor has appointed a committee to work out the new advanced directive. There's no requirement for who that those members are. And as you probably know, there are a lot of people in Oregon who are affiliated with Compassions in Dying. The assisted suicide world is very big in Oregon, so we anticipate that there probably will be pretty strong connections to them. And then healthcare provider can then become the healthcare facility. Not only, it will be defined as not only your physician or your nurse practitioner or physician assistant, but actually the facility itself. And this came about as a result of the Nora Harris situation in Southern Oregon, where her husband wanted the facility to stop feeding her because she had dementia. And they said, well, no, we feed people that we care for. That's something we do. They took it to court, and the court said, no, we don't have jurisdiction to compel them. So now the advance directive might just open that door. So really watch for this and beware. So, like I said, the most important part of the advance directive is choosing that healthcare representative, because this person can legally speak for you and has the right to make determination about life-sustaining treatment, CPR, other things like antibiotics, those sorts of things. So find someone that you trust, respect, and can really communicate with well, and who can make sound decisions under stressful situations, because this often is very stressful, as you can imagine. Who has a sound understanding of your ethics, and who can communicate and is committed to communicating what you want, and who can apply practical wisdom in changing circumstances. Because you can't even sit down and say, gee, if this happens, this is what I would envision. And they just can't ever know the details that you're going to face. And so sometimes it's ethical to start a treatment, and then if you learn that it's not benefiting anymore, then to stop that treatment. But sometimes that stopping can be a very difficult situation. And that might be an example of something that you never really talked about specifically, but someone who can really make that decision for you in changing circumstances. Preferably someone who lives nearby and is readily available, but I wouldn't choose my closest geographical person over someone who could really who knew me better, that sort of stuff. I would give higher ranking to the person who can really speak for me, communicate with me on an ongoing basis, and that sort of stuff. But I also would say that if you're in the hospital, you really want an advocate when you're there. And it's not an honorary position. It doesn't go to my oldest son because he's my oldest son. It goes to the person who I can trust and speak with and think will help me. So again, the take-home points about the advance directive: name the healthcare representative and an alternate, and communicate on an ongoing basis. It's not a one-time thing. You don't just get together and sign the document and say, good, thank you, you're going to do a great job. It's an ongoing conversation as your health changes, as new issues are coming up. Some of these, we were talking out in the lobby, and some of these ethical issues that we're facing in all these different areas of life, who would have thought 10 years ago that we didn't even know the names of these things. So, really someone who can stay with you. And for the second part, for the healthcare instruction part, it's formatted in check boxes. If this situation, then I do or I don't want CPR, I want life support, I do or don't want tube feedings. Those situations cannot be predicted. So what we advise people is just simply take a pen and cross through them, and don't sign that part. Don't initial, don't check any of that stuff. And it's perfectly legal to only do the healthcare representative part and just ditch the other stuff. And don't write, lawyers have said too, don't write a lot of stuff on your advance directive because it can be misinterpreted. So that's my plug for advance directives. Do them, but only do the first part. And really think hard about it and keep communicating. So Chuck.
Thank you, Pat. Thank you, Pat. We'll have time at the end for talking about this in a little more detail. But I think the advance directive is key, and everybody needs an advance directive. Okay, I start handing out advance directives to patients who reach the age of 50. I should probably be handing them out sooner. But the most important part is you need a representative. We've just had a law passed in this Oregon that I'm very, very concerned about. We don't know this. We don't know what it's going to mean. So that's why we don't have a big form to go over, because the form was going to be changed by a group appointed by the governor. So the most important thing is to get a good healthcare representative and don't do the rest, and have someone who can be an advocate. That's going to be the most important message, and it's the take home, and leave the rest behind.
Can I just add one thing?
Yeah, go ahead.
Actually, everybody over
Everybody over 18 should have an advance directive, because with the HIPAA laws, sometimes if you have a younger adult or younger person without an advance directive, the HIPAA laws do not allow healthcare providers to talk to your parents and such. So make sure that you encourage your children to do this as well.
Very good. Let's see. So now we're going to talk about the POLST, and so you did get a handout. It's called the POLST, and we'll be referring to that. So it's a physician order for life-sustaining treatment, and I want to talk to you about it. I'm going to start with a case. So I had a patient. I was on call, and one night for our group, and I got a call from the emergency room doctor who said, a patient of your partner, Mr. So-and-so, he's late 80s, and he's here, and he's got a really bad bladder infection. Matter of fact, he's really sick. He's got probably a bloodstream infection, and we've tried to revive him here in the emergency room. He's brought in from his assisted living, and he's not doing well. And as a matter of fact, he's actually going downhill, and he's probably not going to survive the night. And but he has on his POLST form to do comfort care. And so what we're going to do is we're going to put him up on the floor. We're not going to give him any antibiotics or fluids. We're going to get a nice, comfortable room, and he probably won't be here by the time you round in the morning. And so, but you probably have to fill out the paperwork. It's just we're giving you a heads up that you'll have someone on your list, but don't worry about it. I'm writing all the orders for you. And this is the call I got from the emergency room, which is a kind call, because here's a person who has comfort measures on their POLST form. And I said, well, are you? And I thought about this. Said, well, are you sure it's just comfort measures? Are you sure we're not supposed to do anything? Oh no, it's there. And I said, well, does he have a health representative? Does he have someone who can speak for him so I can call him and just make sure? Because it's a big decision. We either treat him or he'll be gone in the morning. And he said, well, the healthcare representative lives in Texas. And so we really don't have, and we tried to get a hold of him. And I said, well, he lives in assisted living in, Beaverton, so there's got to be someone around. So why don't you call and find out, and I'll come on in. So I actually got out of bed and came in, and I saw this patient, certainly as advertised, elderly man in the hospital, in the emergency room, and he's confused, he's delirious, doesn't know what's going on, doesn't speak much, and his blood pressure is going down because his infection's getting worse, and if we don't do something, he's not going to survive the night. And I finally got a hold of a nephew, and the nephew says, oh man, no. I said, he's in the hospital here, and he's probably not going to survive, and he says comfort care on here. Does he want anything done? I mean, have you talked with him about this? And he says, well, man, we play chess, every 2 or 3 times a week, and he'd want something done. Don't just let him die. I mean, it's my uncle. And so I said, oh, okay, and that was a good information. So I then proceeded to talk to the emergency room and talk to the ICU. We put him in the ICU overnight, gave him some medicines, just some medicines. And by the next morning, he started to turn around. Within 2 or 3 days, he started to wake up, and then he started flirting with the nurses. And he was this old, World War II vet. Turns out that he was in Patton's Third Army. And for those of you who don't remember history, I mean, this is the army that went through Europe and just wreaked havoc in with Hitler's army, Hitler's forces. And he started telling me stories, and And so he's getting about 5 days later, he's well enough to leave, and his nephew comes up and shakes my hand. I want to thank you for saving his life. And I said, a medical student could have saved his life. Okay, we teach this stuff. It's just fluids and antibiotics and just a few of these medicines. I mean, any third-year medical student could have done it. What was hard was going against his POLST. And I had to scream at people that night just to get it to be countermanded. And so the POLST is very powerful. It's a physician order that tells us what to do. And it almost killed my patient. That's why I want to talk about it, because it was first used in Oregon in 1985 because it was an extension of the Advanced Directive. And so the Advanced Directive basically said, who speaks for you, but it didn't really say anything about, what about code status? What about some of these other things? And they said, we need something more. We need to have this code status, the CPR thing, as an order, because a paramedic shows up, and here's a person who's dying, and by law they have to do resuscitation, but this person's on hospice. And why were you resuscitating someone who's on hospice? So that means if you're on hospice, you can't call 911 and all this. So there was some real need to have this. So this became a consolidation, and it would be with the patient. It would be signed as a doctor's order, so people would have to follow it. And it's intended to communicate certain things. And it's some things that the advanced directives just wouldn't take care of. And so it binds everybody who has to follow it, who's a healthcare. Medicine is actually pretty hierarchical, and there's a reason why they call them doctor's orders, because there's an order, and I mean that's what they do. They have to follow it. That's just how it was. The whole medical system is built, and the form has 3 sections: a top, a specific directives, and then a signature. I want everybody to pull out their handout. So we have one. I just want everybody to see what we're doing here. Handout should. We handed them out earlier. We got someone. There weren't enough? But they can share. Share with the person next to you. So if you don't have one. So the top section has name. The middle section has some very specific directives. And the bottom place has a signature. And this is what it is. On the back there's some information. It's kind of not there. So we have a few more over there. If you're not sitting next to someone, you can actually get up and move to a place where someone has one. Be friendly. Everybody here is nice. No one bites. Hopefully all showered. All right. So that's what it is. And what it does is it actually facilitates communication between the healthcare providers and the patients and loved ones about these things. And if you look at it, it's kind of simplified. And if you actually read the different options, the language is kind of biased. And I think it's one of the things that we have to talk about. It actually simplifies it. You could just check box. The first part A, is whether or not you want to have resuscitation or not. So that means, if your heart stops beating, do you want us to do, the shocks and the CPR and bring you back? That's what the first part is. That's the resuscitation. The second part is, well, you're pretty sick and you're getting sicker. What do you want us to do? And on the bottom, there's A, B, and C. There you can say do everything, or do things that are limited, or just do comfort. And that's what that is. And that's what my patient had checked, comfort. And most people who look at that say, yeah, comfort. I like comfort. I mean, I eat a lot of comfort food, as you can probably tell. I mean, I like driving in a limousine, comfortable. I like listening to Easy. That's comfortable. So comfort sounds really good, Limited intervention somehow seems rather sterile or kind of, antiseptic. So even the language here is kind of biased towards doing less. But the other thing that's really important is that this decreases the cost. When everybody has one of these, most people say, oh, I don't want to be resuscitated. Yeah, I just want to be kept comfortable. And guess what happens? You have less medical expenditure. And Medicare knows that they save billions of dollars if people sign these. And so there are some cost implications. And here in Oregon, we actually have a registry. So when you sign one of these things, it goes to a statewide registry. And so the information's there that people can access if they have the ability to do that online. if you have credentials. Now, what are the problems with POLST? Now, POLST is actually, I want to begin, I have been with POLST since it started, and it started for a very good reason. You have someone who wants to die at home, and then they're in the process of dying, but then they become uncomfortable, and someone calls 911. 911 goes out to the house and resuscitates them, because that's just what you had to do before this, in the 80s. And so this was a way to have a do not resuscitate order that could stay at home. So when someone came, they wouldn't do the resuscitation. So I mean, it's a very important thing that POLST did that was good. Since then, like most things though, there's some issues. It was designed initially to be used in people who were really close to death. As a matter of fact, when they first put it out, they had something they called the surprise question to the doctor. Would the doctor, in filling out a POLST, would I be surprised if this patient would be dead within the next year? Would that surprise me? And I said, no, that doesn't surprise me. Number one, you should probably tell the patient about that, I would say. It might surprise them. But number two, that's who this is for, okay? That's the group, okay? The people who are getting there. And so, but now it has been spread to be used, and I get paid money from the health system, from Providence Health System. I get paid dollars at the end of the year for everyone over the age of 75 who I have fill one of these out. Health, we're not. So that's why that's an incentive that I have as a provider, that there's a bonus. As a primary care provider, I get paid to fill these things out. So what do you think happens? A lot of these things being filled out. Check, 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 sign, put in the chart, boom, cha-ching. That's pretty sad, but it's true. So that's an issue. Also, do not resuscitate, meaning do not care. This is something I think my colleague, Dr. Bill Toffler, who is here, he's in family medicine, and I'm in internal medicine. There's a little difference between the two. I'm more hospital-based many times, although being up at OHSU, he's really hospital-based too. But we have a lot of DNR orders on our patients who come in from and they have DNR on their chart, do not resuscitate. And what people read, a do not resuscitate, what they read in that is do not care. And people get less care. It's just true when they have that. It's a powerful order. It's a signed order, and it has to be followed, okay? That's just how medicine works. Can't have everybody running off on their own. You have to be sort of follow the direction of the clinician. Otherwise, it's kind of chaos. And I think that it's possible for a person to say, well, I'm in my 40s and I really don't want to go on, so I'm going to be DNR, even though my responsibility is I've got kids to raise and other things. You might have people sort of opt in for something like this, even if there isn't any trouble. And again, if I got sick and I don't want anything done, you can use this as a means to withhold care, because my patient was going to have all care withheld from him. If you put comfort care, it's just to make you comfortable. That means a blanket, and a pillow. That's what it means. And so, and if you agitated, a medicine maybe to calm me down a little bit. So there are problems with the POLST. And again, I think read through it, it's not neutral. It's a bias in favor of non-treatment. And most people talk about artificially administered nutrition. And what does that mean? Well, could be, or it could be someone, we have it now, someone having a spoon, feeding someone by hand is now in Oregon. If I'm having trouble eating and someone comes up to me and, has a spoon and puts it in my mouth, artificial administered nutrition now. And that was the issue with the case that we just talked about that caused this whole thing. This was a lady who, if we're talking about Nora Harris, the whole reason that this whole case happened in Ashland, this was a lady who had dementia and was requiring someone to help her be fed. It wasn't someone on tube feedings. She just needed a little assistance. She was still hungry. She was still interactive. And the husband said, she wouldn't want to be like this. And here's someone who wants to eat. He said, we got to stop feeding her. And they said, no. He said, so he went to the court, he got this law passed. Now, someone who wants to eat, they say, no, you can't eat, can't drink. And so this is an issue when you're talking about, antiseptic, horrible words here. It now includes, do you artificially feed your toddler in the high chair? I mean, we have my grandkids over, and most of it goes on the floor. A lot of it goes in his hair, but some of it gets down. That's artificially administered nutrition. Comfort measures means non-treatment is what it means. And again, you look at some of the language here. Oh man, dignity, respect, kept clean, warm, offered food. Well, measures maybe. The tone. I think the tone of the provider here, when a lot of doctors talk to patients about end of life issues, they have their own issues and I tell you, I trained in a place, and I can remember trying to resuscitate people who have been dead for a long time because the nurses at the VA check their patients once a shift, and they come in and they see someone who's actually been passed on 8-10 hours ago, and so they call the code, and I'm in there resuscitating someone who should be downstairs. I had to do that. What do you think that does to me? How do you think it makes me feel about resuscitation? I have a horror of resuscitation. Now, I've been there and resuscitated a young person and brought them back and shook their hands as they've gone up. Resuscitation is a complicated thing, and for those of us who have to do it, you have to think about that. And I'll tell you what, I wouldn't want to be resuscitated. So in my mind, I'm putting myself in your place, and I'm thinking, well, that you must be me, I must be you. I wouldn't want you to be, you shouldn't want to be resuscitated. So we have this issue of we put ourselves into those other people. And we see ourselves in them. And so we come across in a way. And so what you're getting is not your choice, but you're getting my choice. And my choice has been informed by some places that you would not want to be. And so that's an issue you have to understand when you're talking with most physicians. It's an issue, it's a big issue. Also, the financial pressure, I told you. And I'm one of the people who actually doesn't do POLST. I don't do it unless I get that person who really is at the very end. And so this is an issue, I think, and I can get paid. My day has financially more rewarding if I fill out POLSTs on people. All interest. Now they say it's mandatory, but it's always voluntary. The thing when you are presented with this POLST form, remember, it's always voluntary. It doesn't require a signature. The only signature that you need on there is a PCP, and that can be a nurse practitioner or a physician assistant. And again, it travels with you, whether you're at home or whether you're in a nursing home. And it is an order. Most of the time it's completed. It's being completed by a nurse or someone who's there. Hey, we need to fill out this POLST. What do you think? Click, 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 and then it runs across the physician for signature. So most of the time it's just an expedient thing. You need to fill out this form, and it comes in. And a lot of people who sort of look at this, there's this issue of, well, if you die, do you want us to thump on your chest and put a bunch of electricity through you and stick a tube down your throat to bring you back? What are people going to say? No. If I'm gone, leave me be. And so there's a huge part of how it gets completed, how it gets talked about. So you have to understand. And I think that if you think about it as a process, it's one of these documents that's going to be put in front of you to look at and to talk about. And I think it's just important to know what it is and that there's some dangers to it. And I think that's the issue, is it should spark communication, but you have to be kind of worried about it. And again, I think similarly with the advanced directive, there's a checkbox format where you can kind of go click, 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 and it's real easy. It doesn't really talk about, like, here I am talking to you and you're healthy and you're thinking, I wouldn't want to have any of that done. Well, heck, man, I wouldn't want to have any of those horrible things done to me either. But if I'm sick, most people when they're sick, they don't want to die. They want to get better. If you're drowning, you don't want to sort of just let it go. You're struggling for life. And so you have to understand that how you might feel when you're really sick is different than how you feel now. And so you might just want to be, and you might want to hold on a little longer. And so you just have to understand that the comfort measures only, they won't give you an antibiotic to treat a bladder infection. They won't give, I mean, it's truly a comfort measure only. And most people don't understand that when they're filling this out. And again, as you go forward, like with this patient, the patient I talked about, he was in a setting where he was incapacitated and the person who we needed to speak to wasn't available. And had I not gone in and tried to see this and talk about it, this patient wouldn't have survived. So, and the healthcare system would have saved a couple dollars, which is actually, I think, the primary intent of POLST at this point. So, and so I think that the take-home points, and we'll open up for questions. Don't fill one out unless you know you're in those last little bit. Now, how do you know that? Well, you might want to have a good talk with your physician about it. So that's important. Communicate with your family. You want to have someone there. You want to have a healthcare representative. And make decisions in the moment, okay? And not having one of these things is actually sometimes really helpful because you can decide right then and there for this case and this person at this time, is this treatment a burden or is there benefit? And that's really helpful because sometimes even someone who's down on hospice, it still might be worthwhile, to treat their bladder infection because they'll feel better. So that's something that you want to do. So POLST is always optional. Don't ever let anybody say you got to sign this. You don't. Number 2, make in the moment decision making. If in the surprise question I think is helpful, and that's what it's about. Would I be surprised if someone wouldn't be alive or would die within the next year? They probably ought to start thinking about these issues because they're going to come up. So I think it's reasonable for that population, but even on hospice you have to be careful with it because hospice again has a way at times to save money and not want to do less, and we see that. Remember that it has risk. I'm not saying it's a bad instrument. I'm just saying it's a sharp instrument, and it cuts both ways. So you have to be respectful of it. And I think it's biased towards non-intervention. It oversimplifies. In contrast with the POLST, everyone needs the advanced directive. We talked about that before. So I'm going to thank you, and we'll be up here for answers and questions. Come on. So here's the question. So he was asked a vague question, and then he found out later that the doctor had actually filled out a POLST form and said something. And did you see the POLST form, or did you interact with it? Not at all. He didn't even interact with it. So that's what's happening, and this provider was being reimbursed to fill that out, and it's real easy to check box. And so you really want to know, you want to ask about it. So that's actually, it's not uncommon. Well, your experience is not uncommon. It wouldn't happen in my practice. Yeah, go ahead. So very good question. How do you get erased? You make a new one. And redo it and have a date. And then make sure it goes everywhere with you. And in Oregon, they're pink. In Washington, they're this hideous sort of seafoam lime green. They're really, you can't usually misplace them. So, yeah.
So what do we put on it if the replacement?
So
Cancel.
So you can actually change your choice.
I did it once.
Change your choices. So you can change your choices.
Do a new one.
Do a new one, yeah.
Cancel across the form. Cancel.
You can write cancel.
Yes.
There you go.
It says void on the bottom.
You can say void. Go ahead in the back.
My dad was,
So that's a good question, and that's really the question.
They do that, but you don't have to. There's no law that you have to. But they do that. You hear that a lot. Yeah, you have to, here's the things you have to do. And sometimes it'll be the secretary who comes and has this pile of intake forms and stuff, and well, lo and behold, there's a POLST form there. So don't do that.
Yeah.
And the other thing is when this whole business about when you go to a facility and they bring you these things, that's really not usually a best time when usually in healthcare situations, it's a stressful kind of time, and that's not the time when you want to be filling out your stuff, unless you're just naming someone to do it.